Genocide in Jos, Plateau State, Nigeria, and Islam. My name is Dr. Kajit John Paul, and today I want to talk a bit about the recurrent conflicts, killings in that part of the country called Nigeria, which is in the Middle Belt. Jos is the town, Plateau State. Killings keep on occurring, sometimes early in the morning, and you find Islam being mentioned frequently as being complicit. Today, I want to briefly examine the question of how Islam comes into the question of the killings in Plateau State within the construct of what you call Nigeria. Before I go there, I should explain that the movement for cognitive justice aspires to build a more equal, just, sustainable, and peaceful world order. And human life is sacred because it's all about humanity. It is a global movement. It is a domestic movement, and it is an intercultural movement. So what happens at any particular domestic scenario, context, affects the global, is the concern of the global picture as well. So at the global context, you will have fronts: the Africa front, North America, South America, Caribbean, Europe fronts, Middle East, Asia fronts, and the Oceania fronts. Now, the domestic is connected to the global, and it is also intercultural. So moving on, when a person's hometown, the question of genocide now, and killings, and the complicity of Islam, in whether or not the complicity, the question, the idea behind that, when a person's hometown becomes their graveyard, when home becomes a place dreaded, when the state of calling a place safe and home no longer exists, that is possibly the situation of the people in the Plateau State, those parts that are subject to incessant attacks has become. This has a bit of history. Before talking about the history of the conflicts in the last 20-25 years, it would be interesting to hear what one of the leading authorities on colonialism in this area had to say. By the year 1900, the different identities in the area you call Nigeria were living in relative independence of each other with different levels and kinds of interaction. Regarding Jos, Plateau, Marjorie Perham, in her native administration in Nigeria, says, in the Plateau, nearly the whole of the 500,000 people are primitive pagans. A note of caution before I go further. In cognitive justice, which is the right to the equal recognition and treatment of different identities, different nations, we object to the use of certain terms which are intrinsically unequal, racist, discriminatory, and programmed to institutionalize that kind of philosophy. The words tribe, pagan, Negro, and similar words we totally reject. But I read them because they are in quotes. Please put them in parentheses in your mind when thinking through the cognitive justice framework. So she goes ahead to say, some thousands of cattle Fulani protected by our peace now roam the bare grassy downs, which are such a refreshing contrast to the endless bush of the plains, while Hausa traders, who in former days would not have dared to show their heads above the escarpment, now live among the pagans. This was 1925. The period she was describing, the earlier period, was 1900, when British colonialism started. The Hausas are a nation. The Fulanis are another. And you have several other nations. I mentioned previously in the video that I have identified 706 in the area you call Nigeria. Now, the colonial construction of what you call Nigeria set the template for conflicts that have continued to unfold to date. And so in 1994, the Justice Feberesima Commission of Inquiry was set up to look into the conflicts that took place that year in Jos. 4 people were killed, several items destroyed, several immediate and remote causes. Some years down the line, in September 2001, there was another crisis in Jos. The Justice Nikki Toby was made to chair the high-powered Commission of Inquiry, which looked into this conflict, and over between 770 to 1,000 persons were killed. Several immediate and remote causes as well. You know, remarkably similar to the previous conflict. And in 2001, between 2001 to 2004, you had a number of conflicts, Wasi, Yelwash, and several others, you know, incidents on the plateau. And over 1,000 people were killed. And in response to this particular conflict, you had the Plateau Peace Conference, which identified remote and immediate causes that were strikingly similar to the preceding conflict as well. 2008, you had another crisis with officially 302 lives, some other sources 700 lives lost. Justice Ajibola Commission of Inquiry was set up by the state to look at this. The federal government set up another commission of inquiry under President Yaradua, and we know the drama and the conflicts that went on there, with some identities avoiding certain panels and attending others. In 2010, again, there was another conflict. Chief Solomon Lar Presidential Advisory Committee was set up. Over 1,000 people were killed, and they found immediate and remote causes strikingly similar to the preceding conflicts. Now, today, last week, some days back, you find recurrent patterns of attacks. Usually, the Fulanis, the herders, are accused of being the ones who launch attacks very early in the morning and kill innocent people. And then you find retaliatory attacks by the indigenous nations of Jos, Plateau area. The narrative also goes vice versa, attacks that way and reprisals the other way. It goes on. How is it that the whole framework of conflict plays out in this manner? Now, we made mention in an earlier video that Europe played a critical role in shaping what you call post-colonial Africa today, and therefore has a hand in structuring the institutional framework that feeds into these patterns of conflict. How did this happen? For a start, to elucidate, to clarify what I said in an earlier video, that the word Nigeria is not something to really be proud of, I would want to make reference to the lady who is credited with having invented the name, Flora Shaw, who later became the wife of Lord Frederick Lugard. She said, Nigeria, as we call our latest dependency, is not a proper name. It cannot be found upon a map that is 10 years old. It is only an English expression which has been made to comprehend a number of native states covering some 500,000 square miles of territory in that part of the world which we call the Sudan. Ancient geographers call the same section of Africa sometimes Sudan, sometimes Ethiopia, sometimes Nigrita, sometimes Tekro, sometimes and more often Genoa. And she went on down to say, always and in every form, their name for it meant the land of the blacks. Genoa, pronounced with the hard G, is a native word signifying black. Now, there is a certain philosophy, the racist philosophy, which we earlier made reference to, by which identities were categorized into the civilized Europeans, entitled to recognition as of right, barbarians, the Ottoman Turks, who are Muslims, and the savages, those, the Indians, the Africans, and so on, who had no right to recognition whatsoever. Now, this thinking, you find it playing into the colonial construction of Nigeria as well, so that the imaginary of northern Nigeria was framed to resonate with the idea of these people being predominantly Muslims. Now, why is it that the colonialists were bent on imposing or institutionalizing Islam as some form of attachment, some form of part of the northern construct? Just to make reference to the part where this, just a reference to the commission, willing commission of which tried to address the issues of the place of minorities, the concerns of minorities in an independent Nigeria. They defined the northern region as follows. There is the faith and the law of Islam first. There is a tribal grouping, the combination of the Fulani, the Hausa, the Nupi, and the Kanuri, all formerly ruling tribes, most of whom have long been adherents of Islam. There is the Hausa language, widely used as a lingua franca. There is a system of administration based on the emir and a feudal pyramid below him. All these elements fusing to make what may for convenience be called the northern system. Then they went ahead to describe in a footnote sense the pagans, the non-Muslims, the non-conformists who exist at the margins of this idea of the northern region. Now you find in several documents how the institutional promotion of Islam, of this idea of the northern region, took hold, and how this diversity in the middle belt of Nigeria became a problem for this British imaginary of Nigeria. By the way, out of the 706 identities in what is Nigeria today, 74 are transborder, 435 are in what you would call the middle belt of Nigeria. The 18 that are extinct or near extinction are largely within the northeast, where Boko Haram is operating. Now, I also made mention of the fact that the British tried to import a racist way of thinking in trying to domesticate the British imaginary of order for the savages in Africa, savages in quotes. I'll make reference to a quote she made, Flora Shaw made in her book. By the way, she was so influential over Lugard that I would say she was practically his student. Now, this is the kind of racist thinking that went into their structuring African society into levels, hierarchies of races, some nations, some identities, some ethnic groups being categorized as superior to others, very much like the way the Belgians categorize the Hutu and Tutsi. Tutsi superior, Hutu inferior. Listen to the way she describes this particular category of people in the area. By the way, bear in mind that there were Arabs in the Maiduguri area who were part of the Cannibal Empire, having failed to conquer the place, as recorded by Heinrich Barth in his the narrative of his stories. Now she says, the true Negro is hardly to be found among these races of the northern inland belt. The cast of face, even when jet black in color, being frequently European in form, with a high nose, thin lips, and deep-set eyes, the aristocratic hand, and the slight, somewhat square shoulders of the Arab of the coast are also frequently noticeable. I shall hope to show that from any time of which history has note, the northern belt of the Sudan has been occupied by races of a higher than Negroid type. Now, it is indisputable that the racist thinking feeds into the building of colonial Nigeria, particularly northern Nigeria. Now, where did this idea come in? Particularly with reference to Islam, which brings in the complicity, directly or indirectly, of Islam. Many Muslims in Nigeria of today are absolutely unaware of how this started. And so I'll give you the benefit. hoping that you get the bigger picture when my book comes out, Cognitive Justice for Pluriversal World Order. You find this whole philosophy rooted in the promulgations of the philosopher called Hegel. Hegel, in his philosophy of history, dedicated 9 pages to Africa, from page 109 to 9 pages onwards. Now, in these 9 pages, he described Africa as backward, savage, the land of children. I mean, out without philosophy, without morality, without religion. And that is where he introduces an idea that became pivotal to the colonial treatment of the post-colonial world. He says, Mohammedanism, Islam, in other words, appears, and I'm quoting him, to be the only thing which in any way brings the Negroes within the range of culture. Now, with this idea, you find it transmitted down the line, and Lugard was a very dedicated student of these scholars. I call this a colonizing epistemology, colonizing way of thinking, where some identities are made inferior to others. As a whole, Africans were inferior to Europeans by this way of thinking. But within Africa itself, the Europeans tried to find and impose that racist hierarchical way of thinking. So whatever was associated with Islam or took on an appearance, physical features that came close to the European form, was categorized as superior and imposed over others. You would find in many of these, in these sources as well, that line of thinking. If you want to understand the whole philosophy, get a copy of Flora Shaw's Tropical Dependency and Lugard's Dual Mandate. There you would see where he promulgated policies. They believed simply in their mission to civilize the blacks. The indigenous African religion, identity, is nothing worthy of preservation and should be wiped out. So the policies were geared towards that. In the Middle Belt, when you go through the proceedings of the Willink Commission, which was set up to look into the fears of minorities in an independent Nigeria, you will see the concerns raised by the non-Muslim communities about oppression by the emir system, marginalization, discrimination, and the harshness of Islamic principles, which they did not understand. And you would see also that right from the start, any effort to emancipate the non-Muslim populations were resisted, not only by the Muslims, but by the colonial British institution itself. So a good example would be the speech given by Sir Ahmadu Bello, why the North should not be split. And you find this kind of attitude built and transmitted. So the idea was to, destroy this diversity in the Middle Belt and supplant it with this British imaginary of identity. So when you see these conflicts happening and allegations of Islamization of Nigeria, many people find it difficult to understand, but when you look at the bigger picture, that is where things begin to fall into place. And you would find the same writer, Marjorie Perham, questioning at a point the rationale behind the British policies. She goes ahead to ask, in relation to the policies adopted by the government, that to what extent should we assist ruling classes which are alien in blood and religion to increase their hold upon their pagan subjects? Now, when you look at the patterns of conflict in the Middle Belt, Plateau, Southern Kaduna, Bauchi, and other places, you see this trajectory being built on. Now, the question is, what do we do? You would see that there's a problem. There is a gap in the political philosophy of post-colonial nation states. How to deal with diverse identities. The British were definitely lacking. They were suffering a poverty of ideas on how to do this, so they imposed this empire top-down homogenizing that's trying to forge a single identity notion. But the reality of diversity remains, and that is where cognitive justice comes in. Cognitive justice is rooted in the idea of appreciating the diversity of the world and forging philosophies, political philosophies that enable equality, peace, sustainability, in a world that is fundamentally diverse. Now, this is an ideal we're promoting, and to those who are busy struggling within the nation-state construct against these killings, both on all sides, including the Muslims, the non-Muslims, people really don't understand the bigger picture, and there is the possibility of building a political construct that gives everyone equal rights. Follow us as we put forth subsequent videos and explore these issues. Meanwhile, we commiserate with those who have lost dear ones, and we wish them rest. All these conflicts are avoidable. The positive aspects of humanity are capable of being, drawn upon to build a better world. So, for those in the Plateau, look out for the movement for cognitive justice, and for all those affected by conflict everywhere, we're confident that we have a template that would enable humanity to coexist and religion to be given its place, in as much as Islam advocates the idea that there's no compulsion in Islam and there's freedom, and Christianity does the same. All religions, including traditional religions, and those who choose to have no religion, should not have their free will compromised simply by virtue of their choice. Follow us on Twitter, look out for our future videos. We're also on the internet and on Facebook, and we welcome your comments and your feedback. Thank you, and do have a good day.